Law number 8 is the law of learning. Learning does not come from experience, it comes from reflecting on experience. We have alluded to learning and the things that lie within this law quite a few times already in the other laws. And it has a lot to do with timing. So just to name that, back when we were talking about conversational timing, you mentioned align conversations, act conversations, and adjust conversations. A lot of learning happens within our ability to adjust and do that often. So what would you like to add to the whole learning comes from reflecting on experience, not just from the experience itself?
We hope that people are going to learn from whatever the thing is that they just went through, but actually having high performance teams come together and reflect on those experiences together to really mine them for what is there to appreciate, what did we do really well, what are the new opportunities, and how do we apply that going forward. We find that incorporating that routine rigorously into how teams are operating actually accelerates their ability to get things done going forward into the future. Too often people talk about it like, I don't want to have to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And so we often talk about it as an accelerant as opposed to something that's actually going to stop you from making progress.
Yeah, it is interesting when we look at the cycle of value about align, act, adjust. There's a lot of places we do analyses inside of companies that's using the people who actually work there to generate what parts of that cycle are you really good at around here and what parts not. And to me, while there are nuances that are different in almost any place we go, one of the most dominant patterns is the companies that all think they're great at action, not so great at alignment, and worst at adjustment.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to be in action, and that's the deal. So you want to jump into action fast so they don't do the work on purpose and making sure we're aligned about allocation of resources. But the one that they step over the most is a thoughtful adjustment. They want to move on to the next thing. And the thoughtful fits with reflection. I also think what you just said about at the level of teams, since this is about collaboration, if we don't reflect together, we cannot harvest the benefit of each other's lessons.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be something I've experienced, and what I learned from this that's you never even considered. And now suddenly, instead of having to go through that yourself, our reflection gave you the benefits of my experience.
Mm-hmm.
So adjust conversations that are communal, that are team-based, with people that are in something together, we find are incredibly powerful. And whenever somebody says we don't have enough time, that's what we refer to them as an acceleration review.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have time to accelerate? Okay.
Well, and what's also really critically important that people forget is that, okay, you might not be great at aligned conversations or there's places you want to improve in action. Well, guess what? If you don't have the adjust conversations, there's no hope for you getting any better at the other ones.
That's right.
So it actually improves your ability to get better and better over time, which is why it's a cycle. You're not supposed to just go around at one time. So with adjustment, we talk about many different occasions that call for an adjust conversation where there is an opportunity for really intentional collective learning. So can we name what those times are, especially the ones that are maybe not as obvious to folks?
Well, I'll name the obvious one first with a word of caution about it. So the obvious one is when things are off track or not going as well. Now, my word of caution is if that is the only time that you stop and reflect and ask people to come together to learn, there's going to be some hesitation because it's going to feel like, oh, this is that meeting where someone's about to be blamed for the thing that didn't go well. So if the only times that you're stopping to learn and reflect and to learn are when things are off track, I think you're missing a lot of opportunities. And you're also starting to set a tone of looking for all of the flaws as opposed to looking for what have you been learning that could help move you forward.
Mm-hmm.
When things are going better than expected, I don't find many teams actually stop to learn from that moment in time, which is unfortunate because if you actually can stop to understand what's causing things to go better than you expect, you can replicate it. But if you don't stop to reflect on that, you're just sort of leaving it to chance whether or not it's going to continue or not to impact the ability of the team.
Yeah, there's a difference to experiencing being happy and experience improving. So I'm happy things are going well. All right, are we actually improving as a function of those things going well? That's a completely different question. And I think the spirit of improvement is really what runs through the whole law of learning. That improvement's always available, no matter where we're in, if we stop to consider, if we stop to reflect. Another occasion for that is if the conditions change substantially. Maybe things aren't going better than expected, they're not going worse than expected, but the conditions change. I made a big mistake on this years ago. We were working on a project with a group of cities that touch each other. It was called the Congestion Relief Program. And it was about how do you get these different communities to cooperate on what they're going to do to deal with this extraordinary traffic problem. Because there's lots of different points of view about that. You know, you're going to build more rail lines, or you're just going to add more freeway lanes, or no, that's a big mistake because it just incentivizes everybody to get on the freeway. You're going to add more buses. You know, so there's lots of stuff. And the most dominant, the largest of those communities, was really important in supporting what we came up with. So in some of these workshops that had people from all over the place, what emerged was a strategic approach that actually had elements of all those things people were worried about, reconciled a huge amount of conflicts. We're really proud about where it was. And then this largest city went through a city council election. So we were moving to implementation. Like, okay, now we're going to actually go make all this stuff happen. You talk about resistance. 5 of the 9 positions on the city council changed during that election. We should, the moment that happened, stopped and said, it's time for all the parties involved in this to stop, take a breath, and review what's happened, where are we, what's worked, what hasn't, what are the lessons going forward, including the new players who are highly influential. I didn't call for that debrief. I just kept trying to go and excited about we have all these things that we're going to go implement, and we ran into a buzzsaw of resistance. So another time is just when the conditions or the players change. It's time to stop and take a breath and adjust.
Well, that one happens with collaborative teams all the time when executive sponsors change. So executive leadership changes, or someone decides that IT has been the sponsor, but now maybe it should be operations that's the sponsor, and they don't take into account that change in sponsorship, whether it's by a person leaving the organization or someone new joining, that they also are going to have a different point of view again. So it might not even be somebody on the team, which we'll talk about in a second when that changes, but it could be an internal customer that you're or constituent that you're having to interact with.
I do think when the team members change, so somebody departs or somebody comes on, whether that's a one-to-one thing that's happening or not, so you have the addition of a role or a loss of a role and somebody hasn't filled it yet. One of the things that I like about having an adjust conversation be part of that shift is that if it is a new person, it actually invites that new person in on the learning that might already pre-exist, or give them a sense of what's on other people's minds. So the recommendation for a team to go have an adjust conversation that they get to sit in on, even if you might think they're not going to have the context for that. They weren't around. Well, let them hear and see what they pick up on, and have them join the cycle at that point instead of feeling like it has to be some whole other track for them or something like that. But
it goes back to the law of inclusion.
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
The other is that when someone leaves a team, one of the questions that we love to ask is what leaves when they leave. I am currently working with an executive team, and one of the head of operations has recently departed. And that was a question I asked, is what leaves when he leaves? And the group said, he's the one who in conversations is making sure we're keeping our promises. And we've all depended on him to do that. So I said, so at your next quarterly business review, who's going to take that on? How are you actually going to support that to make sure that that's moving forward? And they came up with a plan for here's how we're going to make sure his leadership in that area is in the room, even though his body is no longer going to be with us in that way. And so I think we skip that on all kinds of teams, that there is a contribution that that person's making that we will miss when they depart.
Mm-hmm.
So one way that we think about this is any significant change is an opportunity to learn.
Or departure from expectations.
Yes, which is a significant change.
Yeah.
Because right now, we live in a time where people love to say, we're in permanent white water. It's all change all the time. Okay, well, that means it's all learning. So people having the routine, the patience to learn. Somebody whose work I admire is Ron Heifetz, who's a Harvard professor, who a big part of his body of work is on what he calls adaptive leadership. And he talks about, for people who are leading organizations, so it's the level of a team or of a whole enterprise, which is just a really big team, he talks about these two distinctions. One is, what of your time is on the dance floor, which is in the middle of the work, causing things to happen, moving things along, being a part of making happen what we've promised. Speaking about promises. He said, and as important is time on the balcony, where you step back and you look at the whole system and you consider what's been happening and you learn from that. And ever since I first heard that, I was in something with him in 2008, I think it was. I've started to see how many executives really don't allot much time on the balcony. It's like, well, we have our fourth quarter strategic retreat. All righty. But a routine of reflection where you stop and look back. And one of the things I see that it costs when leaders don't have a routine of reflection, it costs seeing the system in terms of how are we making the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard. And that's a big danger, because then we start to deal with learning like it only occurs at an individual level. Mm-hmm. So for you, you had those people as a team look at what leaves when he leaves and who are we in the matter. Mm-hmm. So they're in their small system of work. We're thinking of this at the level of a system. Because I think one of the most important things to scrutinize every time there's an adjust conversation is, given what we've learned from what worked and what didn't work, as we move forward, how are our improvements making the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard? Because if you don't have that perspective, it will almost always devolve into blame.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
One of the things that I've been really noticing lately is that, and it's partly the way we talk about it. So we talk about timing as align, act, adjust. That is the way that we often say it. And to your point about how the system operates, even if you have a brand new internal objective or internal team, they have been working in the system.
Right.
And so actually start launching a team with an adjust conversation, I think is an interesting way for that team to really learn from their past experiences of working on something similar in the system, of trying to affect change in the system, to see what are the things that they are bringing from their past experiences to this particular project that they should be counting on one another for. Even if it's somebody that's brand new to the organization, where might they have had experiences like this in the past that we should know to look to them for, because they are going to have something to say about it? Where have we run into challenges along the way when we've tried to implement, what did we learn about that? And so often when we talk about align, act, adjust, when we ask people, well, how's it going? They'll say, well, we haven't had a moment to adjust yet. Actually, I think we could actually start the whole cycle, start a whole project with an adjust conversation if we really take it in the spirit of learning. What have we learned from past successes and disappointments that we want to bring to this experience to help accelerate the work together?
Which actually sets up the intersection conversations at the beginning of alignment really well, because you're having an opportunity through adjustment to research, what does this person have to offer? What do they have to contribute? What are their cares and their concerns and all of that might contribute to our effort? So you can call one another in a different way to that intersect conversation. Mm-hmm. So adjustment, we do have a protocol that we'll include in the show notes for folks so they can use it as a resource. And it's just suggested questions for designing a conversation where a team is going through adjustment. And there's really two focuses of those questions. The first being review, so the looking backwards, the retrospective, as some might say, on what really happened. This is where accuracy and trading explanations and learning from them comes in. And then there's the renewal of our commitment. So then what does that have to do with how we move forward, which is really where the value of the learning comes into play. But really putting it to action matters. There's also something about learning. So within the law of learning, beyond just adjustment, just this spirit of learning that comes to both leadership and to collaboration. So what else would we have to offer about that? Just having learning as a spirit or mindset that's embedded.
I think that there's a vitality that emerges when people learn something from having been in action. It reaches back into it and makes it more meaningful, more worthwhile. It's like the enjoyment of that visited me now. It has me realize that was pretty good. Because when we learn, we actually redeem moments of disappointment and affirm moments of great accomplishment, which allows both of those to then go forward and be replicated. So I think getting that an adjust conversation is a source of energy for people, because learning actually creates energy. It creates optimism. That's why we say that even when you've had a failure, the integrity of failure is its return on investment. Like, what have you learned from it? It's going to produce so much benefit going forward. That failure's got an ROI. And so I think that appreciation that learning is not only smart, it's also emotionally intelligent, not smart just intellectually. It actually gives people the energy to move forward in life, benefiting from what they've been through. So I think that's one part of the mentality. There's a passage from Time and the Art of Living by Robert Grudin that I really love, where he says, hard work crystallizes into pleasure as you grow in skill. So every time we really reflect and we improve, you're having hard work crystallize into pleasure. To me, that's a nice mindset.
I think the other is one of curiosity, and going back to our last conversation is really looking for alternate explanations to really see what are some of the explanations for why something either went well or didn't go well that unlock us for the future. A number of years ago, we were running a multi-month leadership experience in Richmond, Virginia, which is important to the story. And it had a series where we were gathering leaders about once every 6 weeks. And the thing was planned out with programming for each one of the sessions. And one of them was in February, and it happened to snow, which in Richmond is actually not that common. And so what happened was we couldn't hold the session because we couldn't get there and nobody else could get there. And so it had a cascading effect of messing up all of the programming for the rest of the year, which was a headache because, as we know, getting on people's schedules and calendaring things. And when we were running an internal debrief and an adjust conversation and having this discussion, and somebody said, well, what are the chances it's going to snow again? And why should we be really looking at that as something to learn from? And I said, well, except snow happened to be the thing that tripped us up this time. When we run things like this, we should have some sort of contingency planning as a backup for what are we going to do, because while it was snow this time, it could have been hurricane, it could have been power outage, it could have been fill in the blank that we hadn't taken into account in our planning. So I think there's the spirit of like, well, what can we learn from this? What is possible? Because it's really easy to have an impotent, as we would like to say, an impotent explanation that has us stuck, that it's whatever the success or lack of success is based on some external factor, and we don't take into account that there's something for us to learn from that external factor.
Right.
And how might it evolve in that example, our system of design? because that becomes a huge thing. All right, what can we predict in the array of potential scenarios?
Right.
And which of those are we prepared for, which not? That adds something to the whole design protocol.
That's exactly right.
And I think that's one of the places when you have a team reflecting on something, where you've got collaborative power is when you notice that the conversation does not go to whose fault it is.
Mm-hmm.
It goes to what happened, not who's to blame.
Yeah.
And you're looking together at what is there for us to learn from that,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I love that question so much about how do we make the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard?
Right.
Because somebody might see something that I'm missing in that moment and we have an insight and it changes the way the work gets done
Mm-hmm.
rather than just what I don't like when learning is individualized and it doesn't occur in a team of people who are working together on something. It can be dangerous to veer towards blame.
Right. Well, and I think what's really important about that is how do you as a team care for having a culture and environment within which people are learning all the time and that's the default? Because I think even talking about high performance and then being a committed learner in everything, I think can sometimes actually feel at odds with one another in practice, because high performance, a lot of high performing or high potential people have probably been celebrated for being really exceptional at a thing or being great at executing on things. And so the cultures that we run into are people with stuck mindsets where they hit a roadblock because they don't know how to allow themselves to be in a state of learning, which can be stumbly and not so graceful. Like our colleague Kel always compares it to, a toddler learning how to walk is not, oh, I'm going to walk today. And then you just stand up and do it. There's this process of what does that take and how do you build the muscles in order to do it and the coordination. And so giving each other the space in order to be able to do that, I think it also takes having that grace for yourself. But in order to have a team that's high performing, you actually have to have that be the default of how you're relating to one another and what performance actually is.
And sometimes in those stumbles, what you find in the learning and reflection is an apology might be necessary, and it might actually be really powerful. Years ago, I was doing work in a client system, and we walked in one day, and the whole room was sort of a buzz, like, and I said, "What in the world?" And somebody said, "You're not. We just can't believe the meeting that we just came out of." And they said the chief technology officer stood up and said, "I have to apologize to the entire team that's been working on this particular implementation. They told me that they were going to need more resources. I did not advocate to get more resources. And as a result, we are both behind and everybody's exhausted. And that's on me, and I apologize." And they were all flabbergasted that he had stood up and apologized. And it made such an impression on them that he was taking responsibility for not giving the team the resources that it needed. But he earned so much respect and regard that day from just a simple, well-timed apology that I'm sure must have happened out of a learning around why this particular system implementation was not going as planned. And so sometimes there is a need. So it doesn't have to be about blame, but there might be a time to actually make an apology inside of that learning and reflection. There might also be things to celebrate inside of that learning and reflection. And so how do you actually pay attention to both? And one doesn't actually have to come at the sacrifice of the other.
Well, I think that if someone knows that there's something they could have done differently or better, and they acknowledge and apologize for that, it actually frees the room. It now gets something in the open that we don't have to anguish over. And it now allows people to say, so what can we learn from it? It takes away a barrier to learning. So I think that's powerful when somebody does that.
Mm-hmm. And something that leaders or those with a lot of influence, I think, need to be mindful of where they're setting the standard for how people react to those moments. Mm-hmm. So having this demonstration of taking responsibility rather than a demonstration of a a default to blame, I think starts with leadership. You know, a lot of teams are actually mirroring things they've seen elsewhere or seen their leader already do or things like that. So I think the taking responsibility for where you can is actually just a model of how you'd like others to behave as well. So the inspiriting learning is really important. Yeah.
Todd Conklin, who has done a lot of research and study and writing on high performance and safety environments. One of the things he says in his 5 principles of high performance that I think is really provocative and worth bothering oneself with is you cannot blame and learn and improve at the same time.
Right.
That's really provocative. And I love that provocation because he's saying, choose. Do you want to go for the benefits of blame, or do you want to stop and take a breath and see what can we, as the system of work, learn from this? And I think that's hugely important. So back to what you said earlier about what's the mood or mindset of this. I like that confront. Can I feel myself moving towards what I think's wrong with that person? And instead of what is there for us to learn from this that actually has the system learn?
Right.
That's why I've always loved one of our commitments we've had in our practice is that our best day is never behind us.
And that our last promise in our promises is, and with compassion and forgiveness. We won't always get it right, so with compassion and forgiveness, we will learn and grow together. But it takes compassion and forgiveness because we will screw up. The pretending you're not going to screw up doesn't help anybody either.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing Conklin says is humans are fallible. Like
Yeah.
everyone-
Right, exactly. Yeah.
His first principle is that humans actually make errors.
Yes.
Big surprise. What? I had no idea.
Well, the other thing I think that's important to touch on before we leave this particular law is the teams are operating inside a system. And our colleague Kel loves to say systems are operating exactly as they're designed, right? And so when you run into something, it is worth sort of examining what does that tell you about the system at large? Because as Kel also likes to say, you're not in traffic, you are traffic. So we all are part of the system that's causing whatever that thing is that might be slow or tense or lacking joy, right? And so how do we actually learn from that? Because we have the opportunity to constantly change the system also.
Right. Well, and I think this is a perfect segue into our next law of accountability, so that learning and having this spirit of and commitment to learning, it has so much to do with how you approach things like accountability. So
I want to say
next.
more
Yeah.
thing in closing here, though. Is
okay.
that all right?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Make it.
It's a conversation, so what the heck. I just want to point to someone who I admire that I think allows for what you just said to happen, which is confronting how the system's designed. Years ago, when we first started working in the Fleet Ballistic Missile System, which is the nuclear submarine-based system of protection for the United States and the United Kingdom, and Captain Sloan was in charge of that, and was concerned because she inherited an environment that had a 3-year commitment to an affordability breakthrough to take costs out of the system. And over those 3 years, she noted costs had gone up. And I remember the first meeting we had when we said, we'd like you to consider that your system is perfectly designed for the escalation of cost. And she stopped and took a breath and said, I guess there's evidence to support that. And that led to her examining the system with people from all over it in a new way to discover what in it actually was perfectly designed for what they were reliable for, which is cost going up. And that then caused the revelations of what there was to change and improve that caused the breakthrough for them in the cost that it took to operate their system.
Mickey, that story is such a great example of how these laws interplay with one another. Because the only reason that could work for the Fleet Ballistic Missiles team was if she was really present to what was happening, not judging how she thought things should be going. And so the law of presence really comes into play so deeply inside the law of learning, because you've got to actually be present to what's happening in order for performance to improve.
Right. Well, I think that the presence that allows you the space to be in a learning mindset is what allows you to take accountability where necessary or guide a culture of accountability. So we will get to that next in the law of accountability.